on hearing, don't understand. Who will be watchmen in Zion? Who will keep the blood from his hands?
Well, welcome to the Mind of Christ, and welcome to our new time on Friday at 11. Thank you for joining us, and if you are joining us at another time later on, that's great too. We're glad to have you. We are continuing our study of the Mind of Christ. I call it Challenger Deep, which is a reference to the deepest part of the ocean, over 36,000 feet deep. It's a pretty big hole, and I use that metaphor in order to try to capture the idea of how deep the mind of Christ actually is, and that how we're going to have to dive down pretty deep in order to understand it. So this is an in-depth study that took me 7 years to complete. If you can ever say it's completed, it took me 7 years to get through all of what Jesus said and did and record that in 21 journals. I'm in the third journal right now, and we're looking at a section that, I have to go back and look, I think it's section 49. We've had 2 lessons on this already, and I'm not finding the very beginning of it here, but I believe it's section 49. And we're making our way through it. It covers all of John chapter 5, and we have covered essentially up to verse 24 thus far, and we will get a little further into it today. There will be one more lesson on this section next week, Lord willing. So I'd like to kind of go back and read. Again, I'm using the New International Bible because it's a very literal translation, and since we're doing in-depth Bible study, I like to keep this this translation as our major text. So in verse 24, Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has eternal life, and does not come into judgment, but has passed out of death into life." Now he's going to expound on this from death to life matter in the verses that follow. He says in verse 25, "Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear shall live. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave to the Son also to have life in himself." That phrase, "in himself," is going to be very critical for us to understand. And he gave him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, and those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. I can do nothing on my own initiative. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I alone bear witness of myself, my testimony is not true. There is another who bears witness of me, and I know that the testimony which he bears of me is true. Okay, we're going to stop right there. So we're going to cover essentially from verse 25 to verse 32. There's not a real good place to divide all of this up because it's one discourse by Jesus, but for sake of time, that's what we're going to do. So this picture of passing out of death into life is now applied to the resurrection of the dead. And so if you think from going from death to life, think resurrection. The ability to raise the dead resides in Jesus at that point in time because the Father has granted Jesus to have life in himself. Jesus is not merely alive, he has the ability to impart life. Okay, so again, Jesus also will have the ability to impart life finally in the resurrection, but while he was on earth, he had the ability to impart life. It says the hour is coming, we're in verse 25, the hour is coming and now is. Okay, the main resurrection is still coming, in which Paul calls the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and following. This will be a magnificent day in which the dead in Christ will rise and the living will be caught up with them to meet the Lord in the clouds or in the air. Even now, after 2,000 years, we are not unaware, and we are sons of light and of day, and have been forewarned that Jesus is coming again and there will be a resurrection on that day. Just as hearing Jesus was and is essential to life, now as we spiritually pass out of death into eternal life, so will those physically dead have to pass out of death into life by hearing the voice of Jesus. So there's two senses in which we pass from death to life. One is in the spiritual sense of when we were spiritually dead and we passed over into life. But the other is when we are physically dead and we're passing over into this new life. In John chapter 11, it is a perfect example of this. Lazarus, he said, come forth. And so can the dead hear? He speaks about the dead hearing the voice of the Son of Man. Can the dead hear? Well, I suppose it depends on who is speaking to the dead. When Jesus speaks, the dead listen. Here Jesus refers to himself as the Son of God in this particular text. He doesn't often refer to himself as the Son of God. He mostly refers to himself as the Son of Man. But when he's calling forth a dead person, at least in this case, he refers to himself as the Son of God. He continues to identify himself with the Father. The very thing the critics, remember, there are a number of critics here, they don't like him doing that, comparing himself to the Father. Remember, this is in the context of the man who was healed at the pool of Bethesda, and it was done on the Sabbath day, and Jesus is in the middle of explaining why the Sabbath laws really don't apply to him, because he is still working, he's always working, and the kinds of things that he is doing in his relationship with his Father cannot come under some kind of Sabbath law. The coming hour is reserved for all who are in the tombs, according to verse 28, as he says a little bit later on, so that they can come out of the tombs. But during Jesus' life on earth, he called a few people out of the tombs or from the dead. The result will be life. Jesus judges live people, not dead people. They have to be conscious and present in order to be judged. That's why after someone commits a crime, if they're killed, they can't be prosecuted, because you can't prosecute a dead person. Here Jesus emphasizes the dead hearing, quote, his voice. What of those who claim to raise the dead by using their voices? Is the voice of Jesus the only voice that can raise the dead? It seems so from this context, because he has been given by the Father, he's been given life in himself, which we'll continue on here in the notes. The ability to cause the dead to rise demands the one causing it to have life in himself. The Father has life in himself, and he has caused, or he gave to the Son to have life in himself. The word life here is the word Zoe, basically the word Zoe. It's life or living existence. It's used in Luke 16:25 when Abraham said to the rich man that during your life, or during your Zoe life, it's used in Acts 17:25 where it says it is God who gives to all life, breath, and all things. The word life here is used in 1 Corinthians 3:21 and 22, and it says that life belongs to the Christian. And then in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 19, we are to be pitied beyond all men if we have hope in Christ only in this life. Only in this life. And so if the only hope we have is just for this life, then we are to be pitied, because our relationship with Jesus is not just about a better quality of life here, but a better quality of life eternally. Hebrews 7 and verse 3 is used of Melchizedek. It says that he had no beginning of days or end of life. It's also used in James chapter 4 in verse 14. He says, we do not know what our life will be like tomorrow. And there's just so many passages that speak of this life, physical and spiritual, and of our possessions of it. And it refers to humans and animals, plant life. But in all of these, life is dependent life. Life given and sustained from outside of ourselves. And so when we talk about having life, we do not have life within ourselves. We have life that is dependent life on something else. We have life conferred on us. The life of God and of Jesus, though, is in himself life. It's not external life, but it is self-generated life. It's independent life. It's the difference between being contingent and being necessary. So this is a major distinction between man and God and Jesus, of course, that God and Jesus have life in themselves. We do not have life in ourselves. We can only have life if it is given to us, conferred on us, and also sustained by someone who has life within themselves. But does the language suggest that Jesus emptied himself of this gift on coming to earth, and at some point that the Father returned this quality to him? Because it says that God gave him this ability to have life in himself. So in 1 Corinthians 15:45 it says, so also it is written, the first Adam became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. It's one who can vitalize, who can make alive, who can give life, who can quicken someone. It's used in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 13. I charge you in the presence of God who gives life to all things. Or in John 6:63, it is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and are life. And then it's used in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 6 that the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Also in Galatians 3 and 21, law cannot impart life, and he here equates life with righteousness. So there's a connection between righteousness and life, and you're going to see some of that in the words he uses in talking about the judgment. So life is in himself. It is self-contained. It is internal. It's the difference between the sun and the moon. The sun generates its own light, energy. It has its own life, only because, of course, God made it this way. But the moon has no life in it at all. It has no light in it itself. It's dependent on the sun for its light. In 527 of our text, he says, "And he gave him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man." So, what does this mean? Well, the word authority, exousia, means power to do something. It means to, and then the word execute. And so notice he says he gave him authority to execute judgment. So we need to understand that word. So there's authority, the power to do something. What is the power to do what in this context? It's the power to execute. That means to make or to do or to express some action, either a completed action or a continued action. So what are we to make of this? So we have authority, we have execute, and then the third key word in this verse is the word judgment. And when we put those three together, then it forms a picture. We begin to see how these concepts fit together. The picture is very exact and it's very specific. Judgment, to be just, must be executed, but the execution must have authority. So in order for a judgment to be just, it must be executed, but the execution must come with authority. In Romans 3:26, it says the cross was justice. Surely there was an execution. It was the carrying out of the sentence imposed based on the false judgment that was made by men, but right judgments that were made by God himself. So this was done with the authority of Pilate, an authority given to him from above, ultimately back to God. But the ultimate authority to execute judgment is in Jesus' hands. That's why Jesus says, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down on my own. He, in a sense, executed his own judgment. Jesus says this, so because he is the Son of Man, it says, and the Son of Man part in here is important. He says he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Jesus says this because he is the Son of Man. When coupled with the other verses in this section where Son and Son of God is used, we see that all three convey a sense of authority and legitimacy of relationship to the Father. The Son of Man is not less authoritative than the Son of God or just simply the Son. All refer to one and the same person, Jesus. And so it's not the words that are used necessarily, but it is the person in whom resides authority. One note is Son of Man does not have the definite article. So it's not the Son of Man, it's just simply Son of Man. You compare that to Revelation 1:13 and Revelation 14:14. It says one like a Son of Man. In Hebrews 2:6 it uses a Son of Man. So what are we to make of this terminology? Well, Daniel 7:13 and 14 depicts one like a Son of Man coming in the clouds into the presence of the Ancient of Days and given authority, glory, and sovereign power. So Jesus uses this phrase the phrase Son of Man, he more than anybody else, and says that Son of Man or the Son of Man has authority to, number one, forgive sins, Matthew 9:5 and 6, that he has authority as Lord of the Sabbath, Matthew 12 and verse 8, that he will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, that he has authority to do that, Matthew 12 and verse 40, that he will send out his angels to weed his kingdom, um, and so he's saying he has authority to do that as the Son of Man, and that he is the Son of God, Matthew 16, verses 13 through 17, and so many more cases where he uses this idea of the Son of God or Son of Man in conjunction with his authority. So the picture that Jesus paints here is the fulfillment of Daniel 7, 13 and 14. Jesus was declaring his messiahship in this verse 5:27. The Jews would have understood this, that when he uses the phrase Son of Man and that he has authority to execute judgment, they would have connected it to Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14. Jesus knows that this will get their attention. He knows exactly what he is saying when he is using this terminology. He follows with, do not marvel at this. To marvel means to admire or to regard with admiration or to wonder at. For instance, when the centurion demonstrated his great faith in Luke chapter 7 and verse 9, it says that Jesus marveled at his great faith. This is what Moses did at the burning bush, according to Acts 7:31. It means to reverence or to adore. In 2 Thessalonians 1:10, when Jesus comes again, he will be marveled at by believers and to be filled with wonder and astonishment. It's used in Luke 4:22 in the synagogue at Nazareth. They wondered at his gracious words, or marveled at his gracious words. Some words stun us, cause us to be taken aback. The way Jesus connected himself with the Old Testament about the Messiah was stunning to the crowds. Of course, if he were not the Messiah, his words would be blasphemous. Jesus offers us proof, eventually, of his authority to judge by declaring that all in the tombs will hear his voice, or hear the voice of the Son of Man, and will come forth. And so I guess the authority is kind of in the proof of calling forth people from the tombs. If they come forth, then you know that he has authority. He will give a demonstration of this in John chapter 11. All are going to hear his voice one day, and they will not be able to resist it. They will come forth. Here Jesus said that an hour is coming. The word hour is hora. It can mean a time, a season, a definite space or division of time, a day or a division of it. Other places uses the term a day. The sense is a period of time. It's not necessarily an hour or a day, but a period of time. It has been said, it's known only to the Father when the dead will be summoned to judgment. So back in John 5, verse 29, one might think that Jesus was setting a system of works or judgment based on good and evil deeds. In verse 29, he says, they're going to come forth, and those who did good, the good deeds, to a resurrection of life, and those committing the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. He's not talking here about a system of works salvation. It is true that our deeds are important, but they are a reflection of our faith. The good deed is to believe in the one that the Father has sent. The evil deed is to reject the Son. The verse must fit with all else that is said about salvation here. To literalize the idea of all in the tombs hearing the voice of Jesus would be absurd if taken according to the science of the matter. How can a decomposed corpse hear anything? This reminds me of Ezekiel's Valley of Dry Bones and his being told to prophesy to the bones. Jesus has the ability to speak to the inanimate, just as he or God did at creation, or the sea and the winds that obeyed him when he said, "Peace, be still." Perhaps the word here is accommodative language. He's not using it literally in a physical sense. The test of Jesus' power and authority is concentrated in resurrection power, the greatest sign being his own resurrection. The hopelessness of death is replaced with the possibility of life for those who did good deeds. But though resurrected, those who committed evil deeds will only face judgment. Judgment is contrasted with life. This was also true in chapter 5 and verse 24. The verse 30, Jesus returns to the idea that was found in verse 19. So in verse 30, he says, "I can do nothing by my own initiative." Back in verse 19, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees his Father doing," and so forth. And so in verse 30, he returns to this idea of himself. It is kind of swapped out with the idea of on my own initiative. On my own initiative. He says in verse 30, "I can do nothing on my own initiative." So let's look at the difference between verse 19 and verse 30. The phrase in 30 is a certain Greek phrase. I won't try to give you the Greek language here, but it has a certain Greek phrase here. If you compare it with verse 19, the two phrases look very similar, but not being a Greek scholar, I had to do some research on this to compare the two phrases because they're not exactly alike, but they have similarities here. So from what I can tell, by studying a little bit of a history of the Greek language and its speakers by a fellow named Jeffrey Horrocks on page 356 of his work, the phrases are equivalent terms. So if there is any difference, it means one of them means myself, and the other is found in the third person, meaning himself. The difference is that Jesus speaks in the third person in verse 19 and in the first person in verse 30. And so in verse 30, it would be on my own initiative, and which is equivalent to of myself. This is the only distinction. I'm not sure why the New American Standard Bible didn't keep it simple and just use the same phrase in 19 and in verse 30. But even though all judgment was entrusted to the Son, he still judged according to what he hears. A fundamental truth of all judgment or discernment is first hear and then judge. Otherwise, we rush to judgment. This is a pretty practical application of judgment. If you want to judge correctly, you first have to hear the matter. That's why we call it a hearing. We have a hearing. The goal is to make your judgment just. So judgments have to be just in order to be good judgments. They have to be equitable. They have to be innocent in nature. They have to be holy. They have to be right. They have to fit. It has to be proper. It's acting alike to all. In other words, equitable, even-handed. God is called the righteous judge in 2 Timothy 4 in verse 8. And a similar teaching is found in John 7:24, where he says, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." And so the kind of judgment has to be a righteous judgment, or a judgment that is just or appropriate. Jesus chastises the multitudes for not judging properly in Luke 12 and verse 57. They have great expertise in judging the weather by looking at the sky, so in matters of personal conflict, why don't they judge what is right? Rather, they take it before others to the judge. Paul makes a similar point in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 about Christians going before pagans for a judgment instead of letting wise men in the church judge the matter. In 2 Thessalonians 1 and verse 5, and the context, we see in God's righteous judgment that to repay the ones afflicting the Thessalonian Christians while giving relief. In other words, God, when he comes back, is going to repay those who are persecuting Christians. But in the meantime, he is going to give Christians relief. He's going to give them some kind of ability to stand up under the persecution. Well, when is this going to happen? When is this judgment on those persecuting Christians going to happen? It will happen when Jesus is revealed, dealing out retribution. There will be these will pay the penalty of eternal destruction. The response of grace is there for those who have believed, but destruction for those who reject the Christ. This judgment is deserved according to Revelation 16. God gave those who killed the prophets what they deserved. Jesus gives this judgment at the end of Matthew chapter 23. The same thing is that the judgment coming upon those who persecuted the prophets will be deserved. Further study of this word will help us learn to make right judgments in our dealings with one another. In other words, if you want to study this further, the idea of how do we render right judgments or correct judgments, there's a lot that the Bible has to say about this. But the key to this type of judgment is to be impartial and nonpartisan, to seek a higher will, the will of the one who sends, Jesus. Jesus was so focused on the will of God. His judgments reflected this will. And so how do we come to make right judgments? The only way we can make right judgments if it's centered in the will of God. In marriage, many conflicts can be avoided if both parties merely seek the will of God together, instead of trying to persuade the other to accept their will. In any fight, there are three wills: the will of the husband, the will of the wife, and the will of God. This is the mind of Christ. So Jesus takes up the truth of validation. At first, verse 31 seems to be a switch in topics, but it's not. Verse 31 says, "If I alone bear witness of myself, my testimony is not true." Jesus has been discussing his connection and interdependence with the Father. His enemies see this as equality with God. Now Jesus proclaims that his authenticity cannot be established without his Father's testimony. This is important on many, many levels. The principle of establishing a matter on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses is fundamental in law. 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 1. A person who testifies simply on his own without corroboration to support with evidence or authority can say anything, and who knows what to believe. The practice of backing up your proof is preferred. So Jesus says, if I alone bear witness of myself, my testimony is not true. Now, alone actually is not in the text. It's not in the Greek text. It's implied there. Witness or testimony is the same word, and it gave rise to the word martyr, since those who bore witness to Christ were often persecuted and killed for him. When Jesus says his testimony is not true, he does not mean he is lying. He means that the truth has not been established as truth merely by his own testimony. How does this apply to us? If Jesus needed backup or corroboration, then certainly we need it. We need God's witness, or the Holy Spirit, as in Romans chapter 8, who testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. Or like in 1 John chapter 5, the three that testify, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. But often we need the witnesses of men as well. We should live in such a way that we have the testimony of others, hopefully many, who see us from many different angles and know that we are authentic, real, and true. Husbands and wives are especially important here. If we do not have the corroboration of our spouse, who supposedly knows us better than anyone, what testimony on earth is greater? So how do we get that testimony? Well, we're going to actually break at that point, and we're going to pick up again down in 32, 33, and begin to look a little bit more at that whole thing beginning next week, and we'll try to finish this chapter next week. But this is an important section. It really gets us down into helping us to understand the credentials of Jesus, how he saw his own credentials, how he saw how to verify his equality with God and his special relationship with God, because that was essential to him establishing the point concerning the Sabbath day, that he is Lord of the Sabbath, that he is still working, that he has work that God has given him to do. He has resurrection work, he's got judgment work, he's got lots of work that God is giving him to do, and that the work that he did on the Sabbath day with this man was not to be criticized or to be judged by these Pharisees who were persecuting him. So again, I hope you will join us again next week here at 11 on Friday, and that we will continue our study of the mind of Christ. So God bless you. Take care.
When peace like a river attendeth my way,
When sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my life thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul.
it is well, with my soul,
With my soul,
it is well, it is well with my Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come,
let this blessed assurance control that Christ hath regarded my helpless estate,
and hath shed his own blood for my soul.
it is well. my soul